The message came at 1:17 a.m. We changed all the locks. You don't live here anymore. Good luck out there. No greeting, no signature, just silence and finality. I stared at the screen, numb from a 12-hour shift, thinking maybe, just maybe, I misread. But no, the sender was clear. Mom. And that's when it hit me. Not just the betrayal, not even the eviction, but the brutal truth that I'd never really been welcome. I wasn't disowned that night. I'd been disposable all along, and now it was my turn to rewrite the story. They used to say I was the strong one, not out of admiration, but obligation. By the time I was 10, I could patch drywall, climb a ladder with a toolbox in one hand, and rewire a ceiling fan without flinching. While other girls spent Saturdays at dance class or pool parties, I was handed a wrench and told to be useful. My father, a contractor who never finished high school but spoke like he'd built Rome, loved to joke, "Natalie's the son I never had." At first I laughed. I thought it meant he saw something in me, that maybe, if I worked hard enough, he'd stop looking disappointed every time he saw my face. But I learned the truth the day Sophia was born. She arrived like royalty. Tiny fingers, rosy cheeks, a name chosen from a baby name book my mother read religiously. While I sat in the hospital lobby in hand-me-down sneakers, they passed her around like a blessing. "Finally," my mother said, "a real girl." From then on, our roles were sealed. Sophia had ballet slippers and birthday tiaras. I had roofing tar and calluses. She got piano recitals and pink party dresses. I got steel-toed boots and the nickname Muscle. I remember one summer afternoon, blistering heat, the kind that made wood split and paint bubble. I was up on the roof helping Dad replace shingles. My fingers were raw, nails chipped, knees bruised. I glanced down through the open kitchen window and saw Sophia twirling in the living room, her new tutu sparkling under the chandelier. Mum clapped along, beaming. She never clapped for me. Once I brought home a perfect score on my science project, hand-built circuits and all. I placed it on the kitchen table, hoping someone would notice. Mum glanced at it between stirs of spaghetti sauce and muttered, "Don't leave junk where we eat." Sophia got a BA on her art homework, and it was front-page news for 3 days. It wasn't just favouritism, it was something colder. I once overheard Mum on the phone with her sister, speaking in that fake sweet voice she reserved for gossip. "Natalie, she's complicated. You know, I prayed for a boy. When she came out a girl, I knew God was punishing me." I stood outside the door, hands trembling, ears burning, but I didn't cry. I cleaned the garage instead. There was always something to fix. I thought if I just kept working, just kept helping, one day they'd look at me the way they looked at her. One day they'd say thank you without sarcasm. One day Mum would brush my hair or call me beautiful or tell someone, "That's my daughter, I'm proud of her." But that day never came. Instead they handed me bills to pay, furniture to move, errands to run. Every holiday, every birthday, I was the behind-the-scenes staff while Sophia posed for photos and wore glitter. I once broke my wrist lifting a water heater into place. Dad drove me to urgent care but made me wait in the lobby alone. "You'll be fine," he grunted. "Don't be dramatic." At dinner that night, no one asked how I was. Sophia spent the evening talking about her school dance. I watched her from across the table, wondering what it felt like to be chosen, to be soft, to be enough. But I never asked, because I knew the answer. I didn't mean to find the journal. It was buried in the back of Mum's old sewing cabinet, wedged between tangled thread spools and a broken pair of embroidery scissors. I wasn't snooping. I was fixing the hinge on the drawer like always, because no one else ever would. It was a leather-bound book, soft with age, the edges frayed. I opened it, expecting shopping lists or recipes, but instead I saw her handwriting. Neat, sharp, angry. If I'd known it was a girl, I never would have kept the pregnancy. I didn't breathe for several seconds. I reread the line again, hoping it said something different, but it didn't. I stood there in the dim light of the laundry room, journal in my hands, throat closing in on itself. It wasn't a metaphor. It wasn't an exaggeration. It was a confession. My mother had written down, in ink, the truth I'd felt my whole life. She hadn't wanted me. She hadn't wanted me. I don't know how long I stood there. The clock ticked. The washing machine hummed. Somewhere upstairs, Sophia was laughing into her phone. Life moved on around me. I quietly closed the journal and slid it back into the drawer. I didn't confront her. I didn't scream. What would have been the point? She'd already said it all. After that day, things that once hurt started to make a cruel kind of sense. Why Mum never came to my softball games, even when I made varsity. Why she used to sigh whenever I walked into a room. Why she always looked more relaxed when I wasn't home. Why every Mother's Day I bought her flowers and she'd only ask, "Did Sophia get me anything?" But I still hoped, even after that. I kept showing up, kept fixing her car when it broke down, kept dropping groceries at her door when she was sick, kept working late nights to pay their gas bill when Dad's business was short again. Because somewhere inside, a part of me still thought, maybe this time they'll see me. Maybe if I do enough, I'll finally be enough. But the rejections began piling higher. They started holding family dinners without telling me, posting group photos online, everyone smiling, everyone there, except me. When I asked, Mum would shrug and say, "It was last minute, we didn't think you'd be free," or worse, "We didn't think you'd want to come." And when Dad turned 70, they threw a big backyard party, tent, caterers, jazz band and all. Sophia gave a toast. Mum cried. I watched through the fence from my car. No one had invited me. No one even noticed I was missing. That night, I went home and sat on the floor of my one-bedroom apartment, still wearing the button-down I'd ironed in case someone changed their mind. I stared at my phone. No texts, no missed calls, nothing. I remember thinking, this is what being erased feels like. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet. So quiet. But even then, I didn't walk away, not completely. Because the girl who read that journal, who read those words, still clung to the belief that maybe love could be earned. That maybe, if I just kept sacrificing, they'd finally call me family. I was wrong. But it would take a lock, a text and a 1:17 a.m. notification to make me finally understand. They never saw me as family to begin with. Natalie hadn't meant to overhear. She was sitting in the kitchen making a cup of tea after another exhausting day at the construction site when the faint sound of her mother's voice floated through the thin walls. At first it seemed like a normal phone conversation, a distant hum of idle chatter, the kind Mum often had with her friends. But then her mother's tone shifted, cold, calculated, almost whispering. "I'm transferring everything to Sophia's name. Make sure she's the sole beneficiary. No one can know about this, not even Natalie." Natalie froze, her hand gripping the handle of the teacup, her heart sinking to the pit of her stomach. She didn't move. Didn't breathe. The words hung in the air like a deadly fog, each syllable cutting through her thoughts, each one shattering the fragile pieces of hope she had left. Transfer everything to Sophia. The sentence repeated itself in her mind, over and over, as if the universe was trying to drive the point home. She didn't want to believe it. She couldn't believe it. But the cold, detached finality in her mother's voice left no room for doubt. Her mother, the one who'd raised her, who'd made her feel like a burden her whole life, had now decided, without a second thought, that she wasn't even worth keeping in the will. It was no longer a question of favouritism. No, this was something deeper. This was a deliberate, calculated choice to erase her. She pulled herself together, forcing the tears back. There would be time for that later. She couldn't afford to break down now. She couldn't let them see her weakness, not when they were already planning to erase her completely. Natalie set the teacup down on the counter, her mind racing. She needed proof. She needed something concrete. She wasn't going to be blindsided again. Not by the people who were supposed to love her. Not this time. She went to the garage, rummaging through the pile of old paperwork and receipts from the years of working on the house. Repairs, renovations, payments she'd made from her own bank account. There had to be something here, something that proved she had been more than just a worker in her own family, something that would give her leverage. It didn't take long for her to find it. A dusty folder filled with old invoices, construction contracts and payment records. The name of the contractor on some of the documents caught her eye. It was the same one she had dealt with a few years back, the one who'd worked on the roof repairs after the storm. She remembered paying him directly because her father had been too busy to handle it himself. She also recalled getting the receipts for the supplies she had bought, paint, lumber, tools, all under her name. She gathered everything she could find and made copies. The hours spent working on repairs, the emails from contractors, the bills she'd paid, the work she'd done in place of them. Each piece was a link in the chain she would use to reclaim what was rightfully hers. As she dug through more old files, her phone buzzed with a new message. It was from her mother. "Stop looking into things, Natalie. This isn't your business." The words burned, but Natalie only smirked. It was a threat wrapped in a warning, but to her it was nothing more than an acknowledgement that she was getting close to the truth. She wasn't going to let them shut her down. Not now. Not when she finally had the power to fight back. In the days that followed, Natalie became a quiet force. She took her lunch breaks to visit the local law office, where she sat down with a lawyer who had helped her with smaller issues in the past. She presented the evidence she'd gathered, paperwork, email trails, proof of payments, and explained the situation with her family. The lawyer, a sharp woman named Linda, didn't say much at first. She simply reviewed the files, her eyes scanning each document with precision. When she finally looked up, her expression was serious, but not without a flicker of respect. "You've done the hard part," Linda said. "Now we have a case. They've been exploiting you for years, Natalie. It's time they paid for it." As the days passed, Natalie felt herself sinking deeper into the murky waters of her family's deceit. What started as a simple act of self-preservation, gathering receipts, collecting records, had quickly turned into an all-consuming quest for the truth. She spent hours poring over the files, flipping through stacks of papers, her mind always racing. The more she uncovered, the more she began to realise the extent of the lies her family had built around her. But nothing prepared her for what she found one late evening in the corner of the basement storage room. She was going through the last of the old insurance documents, hoping to find something, anything that would confirm her suspicions. There, buried beneath a pile of faded tax returns and old utility bills, was a file labelled Homeowner's Insurance Claim 2012. It wasn't unusual to find such a file. After all, there had been a small fire in the garage that year. What was unusual, however, was the name listed on the insurance paperwork, Natalie Green, signature forged. Her heart skipped a beat. Natalie pulled the file from the stack, her hands trembling as she opened it. Inside was a claim form for damages caused by the fire. She scanned through the paperwork quickly, her eyes landing on the total payout figure, $10,000. The insurance company had issued the cheque in her name, but there was no mention of her. It wasn't just that they had used her name, it was that they had used it without her knowledge. They'd filed the claim after the fire, without her consent, and collected the payout. But there was more. In the middle of the claim documents, she found a photocopy of a cheque made out to Sophia Green for the exact same amount, $10,000. Her signature was clearly visible at the bottom, endorsing the cheque. Natalie's pulse quickened. Her mind raced. Had they caused the fire? Had they staged it to claim the insurance money? She couldn't deny the sinking feeling in her stomach. There had always been something off about the fire. It had been contained in the garage, limited to a few damaged shelves and some smoke damage to the walls. No one had been hurt. It had been too convenient, and now it seemed that it had been more than just an accident. Natalie dropped the file onto the table, her hands shaking with a mix of anger and disbelief. She sat there, staring at the documents, the truth of her family's manipulation unravelling in front of her. They had exploited her, her labour, and now her identity. They'd used her name, her reputation, to get money without her ever knowing. But what troubled her more was the realisation that this might have been intentional. That fire, the claim, the forged documents, they weren't just careless mistakes. They were calculated moves to take advantage of her, to use her for their own benefit. And it had worked. For years, Natalie had worked tirelessly for her family, cleaning up their messes, paying their bills, fixing their house, all in the hope that they would one day see her as something more than a tool. But now it seemed that her role in their eyes had always been one of convenience. She had never been their daughter. She had been an asset. Her anger burned hotter now, sharper. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was the fact that they had treated her like nothing more than a pawn in their game. With this new discovery, Natalie felt the weight of the decision she had to make. She could confront them. She could call them out, expose them for what they'd done. But that would mean facing her mother's indifference, her father's silence, and Sophia's confusion. Would it even be worth it? Or would they deny it all, twist the truth and accuse her of being paranoid? Would they once again gaslight her into believing she was the one in the wrong? But then a thought hit her. If they had staged the fire, if they had been willing to use her name and lie to the insurance company, what else were they capable of? No, Natalie wasn't just going to confront them. She was going to take action. She was going to turn their game back on them. This wasn't just about getting justice for herself. It was about taking control of the narrative that had been written for her, about rewriting the story her family had told to serve their own interests. Natalie stared down at the claim documents, her resolve hardening. She wasn't just going to take back what was hers. She was going to expose the truth, no matter the cost. It came at 1:17 a.m., just as the darkness in her apartment seemed to swallow her whole. The text message lit up her phone screen, its cold words searing into her mind like acid. "We changed the locks. You don't live here anymore. Good luck out there." No signature, no explanation. Just the cold finality of a family that had discarded her as easily as an old jacket. Natalie stared at the screen in stunned silence, her hands trembling as the weight of those few words sank in. She couldn't breathe. It wasn't the first time her family had hurt her, but this felt different. It felt final. Her mother's words echoed in her mind. "Don't let her know. She doesn't belong here anymore." She had heard it in the hushed tone of that phone call, but now it was real. The eviction wasn't just physical, it was the culmination of years of emotional neglect, years of being the invisible daughter, the one who was never truly wanted. Natalie felt her body sag, her knees buckling under the weight of the moment. It would have been so easy to give in to the rush of emotion, to call her mother, to beg, to try and plead for some semblance of affection or compassion. But she didn't. Instead, Natalie sat back down at her small kitchen table. The paper with her family's forged signatures, the receipts and the insurance claim documents were scattered before her like the pieces of a puzzle she'd been building for months. The truth was all there, waiting to be exposed. She took a deep breath, steadying herself, and instead of reaching for her phone to call her parents, she reached for her business card holder. There was only one person she could trust now, someone who had never betrayed her. Linda, her lawyer. As she dialed the number, her thoughts began to clear. She didn't need their approval anymore. She didn't need them to see her, to validate her sacrifices. She had everything she needed in front of her. Hard proof, indisputable evidence, and the determination to stand up for herself. She would no longer be their servant or their punching bag. She was done. The phone rang twice before Linda answered. "Hello?" "Linda, it's Natalie. We need to move forward with the case. I'm done waiting." Linda's voice was steady but filled with understanding. "What happened?" "They kicked me out, changed the locks, and just like that, I'm not a part of the family anymore," Natalie said, her voice firm but controlled. "It's time to fight back. I have the proof. I have everything." There was a pause on the other end, and Natalie could almost hear Linda taking a breath before speaking again. "All right, you've been gathering the evidence for months now, and from what I can see, this is solid. You have a right to the property. You have a right to your share. They're not getting away with this." Natalie felt a weight lift off her shoulders. She wasn't alone in this fight. For the first time in years, she felt like she had someone on her side who wasn't going to abandon her. "Let's do it," Natalie said, her voice resolute. "I want to file the petition tomorrow. We'll expose them for what they've done." "We'll do it right," Linda replied. "I'll start preparing the paperwork. We'll get them back, Natalie." The connection ended, but the resolve in Natalie's chest only grew stronger. She had been tossed out like an unwanted guest, but now she had control. She wasn't asking for anything. She wasn't begging. She wasn't going to let them rewrite the story of her life anymore. Instead of picking up the phone to call her mother or father, Natalie stood up and began to gather the papers, documents, receipts, emails, all the things she had meticulously collected over the past few months. It was time for the truth to be told, and she would make sure it was loud enough for everyone to hear. She wasn't the daughter they had wanted, but she was the one who would stand tall in the end. She would take back what was hers, starting with the property they thought they could take from her. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the quiet room, marking the passing of another moment of her life that would change everything. The eviction wasn't just physical, it was emotional too. It was the final severing of a bond she had tried so hard to maintain. But Natalie wasn't going to crumble, she was going to rebuild, and this time she would do it on her own terms. She grabbed her keys, shoved them into her pocket and headed out the door. This fight wasn't over, it had only just begun. Natalie didn't expect the call to come so soon. It had been 2 days since her conversation with Linda, her lawyer, and she was already preparing herself for the inevitable, waiting for the legal battle to begin, for the courtroom to be a battleground where she could finally demand justice. But when her phone rang in the middle of the afternoon, she was caught off guard by the name that flashed on the screen. Linda? The voice on the other end wasn't Linda's, but it was familiar. Natalie felt a wave of recognition flood over her. "Hello, Natalie. This is Sarah," the woman said, her tone calm but thick with emotion. "Sarah? Oh my God, Sarah Martinez." "Yes," she answered, a hint of a smile in her voice. "I'm surprised you remember me." Of course, Natalie remembered her. Sarah Martinez had been the daughter of a man who had worked for her father, a contractor who had been swindled by him more than once. Sarah's father had built the extension on their house, done work on the kitchen and bathroom, but he had never been paid. Natalie had always known her father had underpaid workers, taken advantage of the people who helped him. But this was different. This was personal. Natalie sat down heavily, feeling her stomach drop. She had no idea what Sarah would want, but there was a sense of foreboding that crept over her. "I heard what happened," Sarah continued, "and I've been meaning to call you for a while. I just couldn't bring myself to, but now, well, I'm glad I did." Natalie's heart pounded. "I don't understand," she said slowly, her mind spinning. "Why would you want to help me, after everything my father did to your family?" Sarah was silent for a moment, and Natalie could almost feel the weight of the years between them, the unsaid words hanging in the air. "You were just a kid," Sarah finally said. "I don't blame you, and honestly, I don't think I ever could have. But I've been waiting for someone to finally stand up to your father. I've been waiting for this moment for 15 years, and now that it's here, well, I think it's time to do something about it." Natalie's eyes widened in shock. "What do you mean?" "Your father was always cruel to my family. My dad worked his arse off for him, helping with the foundation of your house, the remodels, the repairs. And when it came time to pay him, your dad just ignored us. I was only a teenager at the time, but I remember the way my dad would come home, angry and ashamed, with no money in his hands." Natalie's stomach twisted. She had suspected her father had done things like this, but hearing Sarah's words brought the ugliness into sharp focus. "You see," Sarah continued, "we've been building a case for years, not just for us, but for all the workers your father screwed over. My father was the first, but there were others, and I think it's time we get justice for what he did to them. What he did to you too." The realization hit Natalie like a slap to the face. Her family wasn't the only one her father had ruined, and in that moment she understood something more profound. Her fight wasn't just for herself. It wasn't just about the house or the betrayal she had suffered. It was about standing up for the people who had been taken advantage of by her family, for the workers who had been exploited, who had been silenced by her father's wealth and influence. "This isn't just about me," Natalie whispered. "You're talking about an entire network of people he's hurt." "Exactly," Sarah said, her voice gaining strength. "And now we have a chance to bring him down. I've been waiting for the right moment, Natalie, and that moment is now." Natalie felt a surge of emotion. Anger, yes, but also something else, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The weight of years of injustice was finally beginning to lift, and it was being replaced with something she hadn't dared to believe in. She wasn't alone. There were people who cared, people who had been hurt by her family just as much as she had, and now they were coming together to take back what was rightfully theirs. "I'll do whatever it takes," Natalie said, her voice resolute. "We'll expose everything. We'll make sure they can't hide behind their money anymore." No. Sarah's voice softened. "I knew you were the right person to call. Let's make sure we do this right." As Natalie hung up the phone, she felt the pieces of her life falling into place. She had been alone for so long, but now she wasn't just fighting for herself. She was part of something bigger, a group of people who had been hurt, betrayed, and cast aside, just like her. And together they would make sure that justice would finally be served. Natalie sat at her small kitchen table, the files spread out before her like a war plan. The quiet of the apartment was almost unbearable, a stark contrast to the storm brewing in her mind. She had been collecting evidence for months, but now it wasn't just about the house, it was about everything. It was about taking back her life, her dignity, and her family's silence. She looked over the stack of papers. Construction invoices, bank transfers, email exchanges between contractors. Every page was proof. Proof that she had built this house, not just physically, but financially, emotionally, and in every way that mattered. But her family had twisted that reality into something they could control, something that served their interests. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was a calculated act of greed. Linda, her lawyer, sat across from her, flipping through the evidence with the same quiet precision. She was sharp, focused, as if this case were a chess match, and each document was a move toward checkmate. Natalie could see it in her eyes. Linda wasn't just fighting for a payout, she was fighting for the truth. "I've gone over everything," Linda said, her voice calm, almost detached. "This isn't just a property dispute. We're talking about fraud, misrepresentation, and, if we dig deep enough, possible criminal activity." Natalie nodded. The weight of the truth settled deeper into her chest. She had always known her family was capable of small betrayals, but this was a systematic effort to erase her from the very foundation of her life. "There's more," Linda continued, tapping a folder. "This document here, your mother's signature on the renovation contracts. It's forged. The same one that appeared on the insurance claims. That's what will put them in the spotlight." Natalie felt a cold rush of satisfaction at the mention of her mother's signature. For years she had been the invisible daughter, working in the shadows while they took the credit. But now the truth would come to light. They couldn't hide anymore. "I don't care about the money," Natalie said quietly, almost to herself. "I just want them to see me. I want them to know I wasn't just a tool, that I had value, that I was worth something." Linda paused for a moment, her eyes narrowing. "They'll see you, Natalie, and they'll regret every minute they ignored you." As they continued to sort through the documents, Natalie's mind kept returning to the message she had received from her mother. "You don't live here anymore." The words still echoed in her mind, but now they didn't seem like a threat. They seemed like an invitation to stand up, to fight back, to claim her space in the world. But while she prepared for the legal battle ahead, her family had already begun their counterattack. News of the lawsuit started spreading through their circles, and the narrative they began to weave was one that painted Natalie as unstable, obsessive, and, ironically, destructive. It didn't take long for the first whisper to reach Natalie's ears. A distant relative, a cousin she barely knew, sent her a message. "Are you okay? I've heard your parents are worried about you. They say you're going through a rough time, that you're not well. They're concerned you might be making things up about the house." Natalie's fingers tightened around her phone as she read the message. The strategy was clear. They weren't just defending their actions, they were attempting to discredit her entirely. The words "mentally unstable" had already begun to circulate, and soon it would be impossible to separate the truth from their manipulation. But Natalie wasn't fooled. She had seen this tactic before, how her family had always found a way to twist reality, to paint her as the villain in their own story. This time it wasn't going to work. She turned to Linda, who was already picking up on the subtle shifts in the air. "They're starting to spread lies about me, that I'm crazy, that I'm obsessed with destroying the family. What do we do?" Linda didn't even flinch. She was used to these kinds of tactics. Let them talk. It's the oldest trick in the book, attack the messenger. But we have the facts on our side. No amount of gossip or rumours will change that. Natalie smiled bitterly. It was the truth. But as she stared at the papers before her, proof of everything she had sacrificed, everything she had endured, the whispers from her family felt like 1,000 daggers. They couldn't take her down with lies, but they sure as hell would try. "I'm ready," Natalie said. Her voice steady now, stronger than it had ever been. "Let's go to court," Linda nodded, her expression resolute. "We'll expose them for who they really are, and you'll finally get the justice you deserve." Natalie stood up and grabbed her jacket, the cold night air pressing in as she walked out of her apartment. It was time to fight, to confront the demons of her past. She had spent too many years being silent, too many years letting them dictate her life. But now the truth was in her hands, and she was done being invisible. The days leading up to the court hearing were a blur for Natalie. She spent hours preparing, reviewing evidence, and meeting with Linda to strategize. But despite her growing sense of confidence, the weight of the battle ahead pressed heavily on her. She had done everything by the book, followed all the legal procedures, and gathered every piece of evidence she could find. But it still felt like there was one more piece of the puzzle missing, something that would completely tip the scales in her favour. Then the phone call came. It was early in the morning when Linda called with a sense of urgency in her voice. "Natalie, you need to meet me at the office as soon as you can. We've got something big." Natalie's heart skipped a beat. She had been waiting for this moment, for that one last piece of evidence that would break the case wide open. She grabbed her coat and rushed out the door, the cold wind biting at her face as she made her way to Linda's office. When she arrived, Linda was waiting for her, a manila folder in hand. She didn't waste any time. "You won't believe this," Linda said, her eyes wide with excitement. "We've just been given a bombshell. One of your neighbours came forward." "Who?" Natalie asked, confused. "Mr. Thompson, the old man who lives next door. He's been watching your family for years, and he has footage from his security cameras that could change everything." Natalie's mind raced as Linda pulled out a small thumb drive from the folder. "This is the footage he's been keeping for the past decade. He's been recording everything that happens in your neighbourhood, including what goes on at your house. And there's something you need to see." They plugged the drive into the computer and the footage immediately began to play. At first, it was just typical footage of the street, cars passing, pedestrians walking by. But then there was a clear shot of Natalie's house, the front door visible in the frame. The camera was positioned at a perfect angle to capture everything that happened outside. The timestamp on the screen read 2012, the year of the fire. Natalie's breath caught in her throat as she watched the scene unfold. The video showed her mother standing at the front door of the house, holding a white envelope in her hands. She looked over her shoulder as if making sure no one was watching, before she walked over to a man standing near the driveway. The man was wearing a uniform, and it didn't take long for Natalie to recognise him. He was a city inspector, the one who had signed off on the renovations to their house all those years ago. Her mother handed him the envelope with a subtle but deliberate motion. The video caught the moment clearly. The inspector took the envelope without question, slipping it into his jacket pocket. Natalie's heart sank as she watched the exchange unfold. She knew exactly what was going on. "That's the bribe," Linda muttered under her breath as she watched the footage. "Your mother paid him to falsify the records when they transferred the deed. They didn't want anyone to know that they had lied about the ownership of the property." Natalie could feel the blood draining from her face. The implications of this were staggering. They hadn't just lied about who owned the house, they had deliberately manipulated the system to make it seem as if they had the right to take everything. Her entire life, her childhood, everything she had done to keep that house standing, it had all been a lie. "This is it," Natalie said, her voice shaky but determined. "This is the proof we need." Linda nodded. "It's a game changer. If we bring this into court, it'll completely dismantle their case. It proves that your mother was involved in criminal activity to get the house in her name. She knew exactly what she was doing." The video footage was more than just a smoking gun. It was a legal time bomb. If they could get it admitted into court, it would be the final blow to her family's claims. It was clear evidence of their fraud, their manipulation, and their utter disregard for the truth. "This is huge," Linda said, leaning back in her chair. "Mr. Thompson has agreed to testify as well. He's been holding on to this footage for years, and he's finally ready to speak out. Your family isn't going to get away with this." Natalie sat in stunned silence, the weight of the moment settling in. She had spent so many years fighting for recognition, for a place in her own family, only to discover that her entire life had been built on a foundation of lies. But now, with this evidence, everything was about to change. The fight for her future, for her rightful place, was no longer about pleading or begging. It was about exposing the truth. They had underestimated her. They had underestimated what she was capable of. And now she was ready to take them down. Not for revenge, but for justice. For everything they had stolen from her, and from the people they had used, manipulated, and discarded. With the evidence in hand, they were ready to move forward. The battle wasn't over yet, but this was the turning point. Natalie wasn't just going to take back the house. She was going to expose the people who had destroyed her life and make sure they could never hurt anyone again. The courthouse was cold. The air felt thick with anticipation, the kind of silence that seemed to echo in the halls. Natalie stood in the lobby, her hands clenched tightly at her sides, staring at the closed doors of the courtroom. It was the first hearing, the first chance to lay everything bare, and it felt surreal to finally be here. Her lawyer, Linda, stood beside her, reviewing the case files one last time. Natalie had expected to feel nervous, but there was only a deep, unwavering calm. This wasn't just her fight anymore. This was about exposing the truth, about holding her family accountable for everything they had done to her, and to so many others. She had the facts, she had the evidence, and now she had to make them listen. As they walked into the courtroom, the air shifted. Her mother was already seated at the front, her expression smug, as if this was some sort of game. Her father sat beside her, a wall of silent detachment, while Sophia was seated across from them, looking anywhere but at Natalie. Her mother saw her enter and straightened slightly, a faint, patronising smile playing on her lips. "It's about time you showed up, Natalie," she said, her voice laced with the same coldness it had always had. "I thought we might have to wait forever." Natalie didn't respond.
She couldn't. For so long she'd been the one who tried to make peace, to patch things up, to force a connection. But now all she could feel was a growing sense of justice that kept her quiet, resolute. Sophia looked up when she saw Natalie, her face a mixture of confusion and guilt. Her lip trembled, and for a moment it seemed like she might
speak, but instead her eyes welled up with tears. "I don't know what's going on," she said, her voice breaking. "I don't understand. Why are you doing this, Natalie? Why are you doing this to the family?" The words stung, but they didn't break Natalie. She had long ago stopped seeing her sister as the person she once idolised. Sophia wasn't the girl she had once tried to protect. She was just another piece of the puzzle, one that had been manipulated just like Natalie had. But that didn't change the fact that Sophia, in her naivety, or perhaps willful ignorance, had sided with their parents. Natalie didn't answer her sister. Instead, she turned her attention to the front of the room as the judge entered, signalling the start of the proceedings. The room fell into a hushed silence. The judge, a tall woman with sharp features, called everyone to attention. "We are here today to review the case of Natalie Green versus the defendants, her parents, for fraudulent claims regarding the ownership of the property at 23 Maple Avenue. The evidence presented will determine whether the defendants acted in accordance with legal and ethical practices during the transfer of ownership." The moment the words left her mouth, Natalie felt a shift in the room. Her family had always held a sense of power over her, like their name and wealth could bend the world to their will. But now the law was in control. The truth was in their hands. Linda, ever the professional, stood up and began presenting the evidence. The first document was a copy of the forged construction contracts, followed by the insurance claims, and then the video footage from the security camera, a chilling moment that no one in the room could ignore. The clip of her mother handing the envelope to the inspector was undeniable, and as it played, the room went completely still. The sound of the envelope being exchanged seemed to echo, hanging in the air like a heavy weight. Natalie watched her parents' faces as the footage unfolded. Her mother's smug expression faltered for a split second, but she quickly regained composure. Her father, on the other hand, didn't look at the screen at all. He stared straight ahead, his jaw tight, as if refusing to acknowledge the gravity of what was happening. The room was so quiet, so tense, that Natalie could almost hear the pounding of her own heartbeat in her ears. "This video," Linda said, her voice steady but piercing, "is not just a simple piece of footage. It's evidence of fraud. It shows your client, Miss Green's mother, paying a city inspector to falsify records for the transfer of property. This is not only a breach of trust, but also a violation of the law." As the video ended, there was a long pause. The weight of the evidence sank in, and for the first time, Natalie could see cracks forming in the facade of her parents. They had built their lives on manipulation, on lies. And now their world was crumbling, piece by piece. Her mother shifted uncomfortably in her seat, and for the first time she looked less like a woman in control and more like someone who had been caught in a trap. But then just as quickly her expression hardened again. "I've done nothing wrong," she snapped, her voice cutting through the stillness. "This is all just a misunderstanding. You're twisting everything, Natalie. You're turning this into something it's not." Natalie didn't flinch. She wasn't there to defend herself. She was there to expose the truth. "The truth doesn't need to be twisted, Mum. It's right there in black and white." The judge's gavel came down with a sharp crack, signalling the end of the session. "We will adjourn for today. The evidence is clear, and we will reconvene next week for further deliberations." As the room began to clear, Natalie felt a strange mix of relief and disbelief. The hardest part was over, but the battle was far from finished. She had taken the first step towards reclaiming her life, and now nothing would stand in her way. The following week was filled with tension as the case continued to unfold. Natalie spent every waking hour preparing, reviewing the evidence, and anticipating what would happen next. The courtroom was filled with tension as well, as her family's lies and manipulations were slowly being revealed. When the day of the next hearing arrived, Natalie entered the courtroom with a quiet determination. The previous hearing had been intense, but she was ready for whatever came next. Linda stood by her side, and the same feeling of calm had settled over her as it had the week before. Today, however, there was something different in the air. It wasn't just the usual anxiety before a major legal battle. There was a sense of anticipation, a weight that pressed down on the entire room. Natalie couldn't quite place it, but it felt like the final act was about to begin. As everyone settled into their seats, the judge entered the room, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. But when she glanced at Natalie, something shifted. The judge's eyes softened just for a second, a flicker of recognition that no one else seemed to notice. The proceedings began, and once again Linda presented the evidence: documents, video footage, and testimony. The air in the room was thick with disbelief and quiet murmurs as each piece of evidence was laid out. Her parents sat still, their faces frozen in expressions of defiance. But Natalie could sense the cracks in their armour. They had never expected to be exposed like this. Then, just as the hearing seemed to be at its most intense, the judge spoke up, her voice cutting through the silence. "I would like to take a brief moment to address something," she said, her voice firm but measured. The courtroom fell silent, every eye turning towards her. "Before we proceed any further, I need to disclose something," the judge continued. "I was once a student of Miss Green. She was my mentor in the STEM program during my high school years." The revelation hit Natalie like a bolt of lightning. She had always known she had impacted lives, but to have the judge herself, a woman sitting in power, holding the fate of her case in her hands, acknowledge her influence was something Natalie had never expected. The judge's gaze softened as she continued, her voice growing more personal. "If it wasn't for Miss Green, I would not have gone on to study law. She was the one who encouraged me, the one who pushed me when I didn't believe in myself. She saw potential in me when no one else did. And because of her, I was able to get into law school and build the career I have today. Natalie's heart skipped a beat. This was the first time she had felt truly seen, not by her family, not by the people who had always used her, but by someone who understood her value. It wasn't the approval she had longed for from her parents. It was something much deeper. It was recognition from another person who knew what it was like to be underestimated, to be discounted. And it was that recognition that made her feel like she was finally being treated as an equal. The judge's words echoed in the courtroom, and for a brief moment, Natalie felt like she was being given the justice she had been denied for so long. I will ensure that this case is handled with the utmost fairness, the judge continued, her voice resolute. I have no bias in this matter, but I will not stand for manipulation and fraud. The truth will be heard, and those responsible will be held accountable. The statement hung in the air, as if the room collectively exhaled in relief. For the first time in this entire battle, Natalie could breathe. It wasn't just about winning anymore. It was about being treated with dignity and respect. It was about finding a sense of closure that she had long been denied. Her family, on the other hand, was still processing the shock. Her mother looked as though she had been struck, but she quickly regained her composure, her eyes narrowing with irritation. Her father remained stoic, his jaw clenched, refusing to acknowledge the shift in the room. And Sophia, who had once been the innocent pawn, looked utterly confused, caught between guilt and uncertainty. But Natalie didn't care. The judge had spoken, and for the first time in her life, Natalie felt like she had a voice that mattered. She wasn't fighting against her family anymore. She was fighting for something more. She was fighting for herself. The session continued, but Natalie felt the weight of it shift. She wasn't alone in this fight anymore. It was clear that this wasn't just about a house or a name. It was about standing up against years of manipulation and betrayal. It was about taking control of her narrative and rewriting the story on her own terms. As the hearing drew to a close, Natalie stood tall. The judge had given her the validation she had craved, and in that moment she understood something important. No matter what happened next, she had already won. She had found her voice, and nothing at all could take that away. The courtroom was heavy with silence as the judge delivered her ruling. Natalie's heart raced, but she remained composed, staring straight ahead, her hands resting on the table in front of her. After reviewing the evidence and considering the arguments of both parties, I have come to a decision. The judge's voice rang out, firm and final. Natalie's stomach tightened as she waited for the inevitable. Her mother, her father, and Sophia all sat stiffly across the room, the tension in the air palpable. Her mother's eyes never left the judge, her lips tight in a grimace. Her father stared straight ahead, as if the weight of the ruling didn't matter to him. Sophia's face was pale, her eyes darting nervously between the judge and Natalie. "Miss Green," the judge began, turning her gaze to Natalie, "you have been granted 70% of the ownership rights to the property in question. The house will be liquidated if an agreement is not reached between all parties involved." The words hit Natalie like a thunderclap. She had known, in theory, that this was possible, but hearing it declared so definitively in front of everyone who had ever undermined her was a victory she had never dared to dream of. Her parents had lost. They had used every tactic in their arsenal: manipulation, control, intimidation, and yet it wasn't enough to keep their hands on what they thought was rightfully theirs. And now that house, the symbol of their power, was slipping from their grasp. Natalie's chest swelled with a mixture of triumph and relief, but before she could even process the enormity of what had just happened, a voice shattered the silence. "You've ruined everything." Sophia's voice was raw with anger and fear. "You've taken it all away again. How could you do this? How could you destroy the family like this?" Sophia's words were frantic, her face twisted with confusion and rage. She stood, her hands shaking as she pointed towards Natalie. "I have nothing now. You've destroyed everything. You always ruin everything." The venom in her sister's voice stung, but Natalie didn't flinch. She had heard these accusations before, in smaller ways, in whispered conversations when she wasn't around. But this This was the culmination of years of being blamed for things she hadn't done, of being the scapegoat, the one who was always wrong no matter how hard she tried. Natalie could feel the anger bubbling up inside her, but she remained calm, determined not to let Sophia's outburst derail the justice she had fought so hard for. Her eyes never left her sister as she spoke. "You don't understand," Natalie said, her voice steady but filled with quiet strength. "I didn't destroy anything. I just exposed the truth. You've been living in a house built on lies for years, and I'm not the one who ruined it. They did." Sophia's face twisted with disbelief, but she didn't have the words to respond. She collapsed back into her seat, burying her face in her hands, tears streaming down her cheeks. It wasn't about Natalie anymore. It was about Sophia facing the reality that her entire life had been based on a version of events that wasn't true. But the moment of anger soon passed, and Natalie's attention shifted back to her mother, the woman who had once claimed to love her, but whose actions had proved time and time again that she never truly cared. Her mother stood up slowly, her eyes hardening with cold fury. "You've ruined this family, Natalie," she spat. "From the moment you were born, I knew you would be nothing but a disappointment. I tried to love you, tried to give you a place in this world, but you've always been ungrateful." Natalie felt the weight of her mother's words press down on her, but she didn't waver. For the first time, she didn't feel the need to defend herself. She had spent her whole life trying to earn her mother's approval, but now she realised that it would never come. Not because of anything she had done, but because her mother had never been capable of loving her. Natalie stood up, her legs steady beneath her, her back straight. "I'm done trying to make you proud," she said softly, but the words rang out clearly. "I've spent my whole life trying to please you, but nothing I did was ever enough. I won't be your pawn anymore. I'm done." Her mother's face turned red with rage, but Natalie didn't give her a second glance as she walked out of the courtroom, the weight of her family's judgment no longer holding her back. The sound of the gavel echoed through the room, and Natalie realised that this wasn't just a victory for her. It was the final release from a life she had been shackled to for too long. The house, the lies, the manipulation, they all fell away, replaced by the sense of freedom that came with standing on her own. As she left the courthouse, Natalie felt lighter than she had in years. The world seemed a little less heavy, and for the first time in her life she wasn't carrying the burden of someone else's expectations. She wasn't their daughter anymore. She was her own person, and that was all she ever needed to be. The days following the judgment felt surreal. Natalie had won, but it wasn't the victory she had expected. It wasn't a matter of triumph over her parents, nor was it about getting the house back for herself. In truth, she hadn't known what she'd expected. Maybe she had expected the weight of the past to finally lift, or perhaps a sense of validation that she had fought for what was right. But none of that mattered anymore. It was the last day in court, and the judge had called them all back in. Natalie stood at the front, her lawyer, Linda, by her side. They had agreed to a final settlement hearing, and today the truth would finally come out. Her parents were seated, stiff and silent, in the back of the courtroom. Their expressions were tight, their shoulders squared with a cold defiance. They had no words to say, no arguments left to make. They had been exposed, their lies crumbling around them. But it wasn't about them anymore. It was about Natalie and what she was going to do with the victory she had been given. Linda had already presented the terms of the judgment. The house would be sold. Natalie had been granted 70% ownership, but there was no question now. This was no longer about ownership. It was about restitution. She had something her family could never take back. She had control, and it was time to use it for something greater than herself. Natalie turned to face the judge, her voice steady but filled with purpose. "Your Honour," she began, her words clear and unwavering. "I don't want the house. I don't want to live there. I never asked for it. What I want is to sell the property, and when it's sold, I want to make sure the proceeds go to the people who have never been paid. The workers my father swindled, the people who were never compensated for their labour." The words hung in the air, and for a moment the courtroom was silent. Everyone seemed to be processing what Natalie had just said. Her parents, who had been preparing for another round of legal sparring, suddenly sat up straight, their faces shifting between shock and disbelief. Her mother's lips parted, but she had no words. Her father's eyes narrowed, a scowl deepening across his face. "What are you talking about?" Her mother finally spoke, her voice shaking with disbelief. "You're not serious. You would sell the house, everything you've worked for, just to make a point." Natalie's gaze never left her mother. "It's not a point, it's justice. My father used those men. He used them for his own gain, never paid them for their work, and never once acknowledged what they did. This house wasn't just built on hard labour, it was built on exploitation. So no, I won't take it back, I'll sell it, and I'll make sure those who were wronged get what they're owed." The room fell into a tense silence. The judge, her expression unreadable, glanced down at the case files before her. Linda too stood still, observing Natalie's words with a quiet respect. This wasn't just about the house. This was about something deeper. Something Natalie had carried with her for years. The weight of being overlooked, the weight of seeing others taken advantage of, and the burden of never being able to fix it. But now she had the power. "I am not doing this out of spite," Natalie continued, her voice rising with conviction. "I'm not doing it to hurt anyone. I'm doing it because it's what's right. My father thought he could take everything without consequence. He thought he could exploit others without anyone noticing. But I notice, and I won't let him erase the people who gave their sweat, their time, their work, and never got anything in return." The room was still. Her parents sat in stunned silence, unable to counter her words. Her father's face flushed with anger, but there was no retort. There was no defence against the truth. Sophia, seated beside them, looked pale, as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. Natalie turned back to the judge, her words now directed at her. "I ask that the proceeds from the sale of the house go to the workers who were never paid, to the men and women who helped build this home and whose hard work was stolen. This isn't a gift, it's restitution." The judge's eyes softened, but her voice remained firm. "I will grant your request. This court recognises the fairness of your proposition. The sale of the property will proceed, and the proceeds will be directed to the workers. A restitution agreement will be drawn up." Natalie felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She had done it. She had reclaimed her life, but more than that, she had given back something that had been wrongfully taken from others. It wasn't about revenge, it was about fairness. It was about righting the wrongs that had been committed, not just against her, but against people who had been used and forgotten. As the proceedings came to a close, Natalie didn't feel victorious. She didn't feel vindicated. She felt peaceful, knowing that the past had been put to rest and that the future, her future, was now something she could shape. Her family sat in stunned silence as she stood to leave. This wasn't the end of their story. But for Natalie, it was the beginning of something far more important: freedom. The apartment was small, but it was hers. The sunlight filtered softly through the curtains in the mornings, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors. It wasn't much, just a modest 2-bedroom place tucked away in a quiet neighbourhood, but it was all she needed. For the first time in her life, Natalie felt like she was truly home. It wasn't just the 4 walls that made it hers. It was the peace that came with no longer living in the chaos her family had created for her. She sat at her kitchen table one morning, sipping her tea, as she gazed out the window. The view was simple: a small garden with flowers she had planted herself, rows of green plants and a few trees swaying in the wind. There was something soothing about the way the garden flourished, the way each plant grew steadily with care and time. It was a stark contrast to the house she had left behind, a place filled with so many broken memories and lies. For the first time in years, there was no pressure, no expectations, no manipulation. No one was demanding anything from her. No one was trying to control her or use her or make her feel small. She was free. Her phone buzzed on the table, interrupting the peaceful silence. She glanced down, seeing the name on the screen. It was a message from her mother. "You'll regret this when you're alone." Natalie felt her fingers tighten around the cup, the heat from the tea burning her skin, but she didn't flinch. She didn't feel the need to reply. For so many years she had tried to explain herself, to make her family understand. She had bent over backwards to make them see her value, to make them love her the way she had always wanted. But now she realised that love from them, real unconditional love, was something that would never come. It wasn't something she could force. It wasn't something they were ever willing to give. So she didn't respond. She didn't engage. She had nothing left to prove. Natalie set her phone aside and went back to sipping her tea, letting the calmness wash over her. She had lived her entire life in the shadow of her family's expectations, their demands, their control. But now she was building something new, a life that was her own, not defined by anyone else's rules but her own. She hadn't realised how heavy the burden had been until it was gone. The weight of constantly trying to make her family proud, the weight of always being the one who picked up the pieces, the one who fixed things and held everything together, sometimes at her own expense. But that was over now. As the days passed, she settled into her new routine. Every morning she made her tea and sat by the window watching the world outside. Sometimes she read, other times she just sat in silence, enjoying the stillness of her own thoughts. She spent time in the garden, tending to the plants, watching them grow just as she was growing, slowly, steadily, and with purpose. No one came to visit her. No one knew her address. And that too felt like freedom. The absence of intrusion, the absence of expectation, was a gift she had never known she needed. Her mother's message lingered in the back of her mind, but it didn't bother her the way it once might have. She had heard those words for so long, and they no longer held power over her. You'll regret this when you're alone. The words were meant to be a threat, a manipulation, but Natalie no longer feared being alone. For the first time in her life, she was content with her own company. She was not afraid of the silence. Natalie wasn't sure if she would ever see her family again. She didn't know if they would reach out, or if she would ever speak to her sister, or even her mother and father. But she knew one thing. She would not return to that life. She would not go back to a world of lies and manipulation. She would not sacrifice her happiness, her peace for anyone, especially not for people who had never truly cared for her. The house she had left behind, the one her family had tried to keep from her, no longer mattered. It wasn't her home anymore. This small, simple apartment, this life of her own, was what she had built, and for the first time it felt right. She stood up and walked to the window, her hands resting on the sill. The wind was gentle and the leaves rustled softly in the breeze. There was a sense of calm in the air, a sense of contentment that she hadn't known before. She had made it through the storm. She had come out on the other side, stronger and more determined than ever, and now, for the first time, she could finally breathe. Weeks passed and Natalie's routine continued. The silence in her life, once oppressive, now felt like a blanket of peace. The apartment was everything she had hoped for, quiet, simple, and free of the emotional noise that had defined her life for so long. There was no more tension, no more walking on eggshells. She could breathe without fear, without the weight of others' expectations pressing down on her. But despite the tranquility, there was always a lingering thought at the back of her mind: her family. She had severed ties, but they were never far from her thoughts, especially Sophia. Her sister's face had haunted her in those first days after the court decision, the way she had cried and accused her of destroying the family. But Sophia was still her sister, and part of Natalie still cared, despite the years of manipulation, despite the distance that had grown between them. One afternoon, as Natalie sat in her favourite spot by the window with a cup of tea, a knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She stood up, surprised, but when she opened the door, there was no one there. Only a small, plain envelope tucked beneath a stack of mail on the doorstep. Curious, Natalie bent down and picked it up. The envelope was addressed simply to Natalie. No return address, no markings that would indicate where it had come from. Her heart raced as she opened it. Inside there was a single piece of paper and a photo. She unfolded the letter, her fingers trembling slightly as she read the neat handwriting on the page. I hope you're doing well wherever you are. I know we haven't spoken in a long time, and I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't know if I'll ever be able to make up for everything, but I want you to know something. I named my daughter after you. Her name is Natalie. I just wanted you to know that someone in this world understands, even if we couldn't get it right all these years. There was no apology, no request for reconciliation, no attempts to explain away the years of hurt. It was just a simple acknowledgement, a small, quiet gesture. The picture that had come with the letter was of a small baby girl, wrapped in a soft blanket, her face peaceful and content. Her dark eyes looked up at the camera, innocent and unaware of the family history that was tangled around her name. Natalie sat down on the edge of the couch, staring at the photo and the letter in her hands. A strange mix of emotions washed over her. Part of her wanted to cry, tears of sadness, tears of relief. Another part of her wanted to feel angry, to resent the fact that Sophia had never truly understood her, had never truly stood by her. But there was something else there too, something she hadn't expected, a quiet peace. It wasn't an apology, and it wasn't a plea for forgiveness. It wasn't the grand gesture she had always hoped for, the one that would somehow fix everything. It was just a small act of recognition. Sophia had named her daughter after Natalie, not to make things right, not to seek approval, but simply because, in some small way, she had understood. Maybe for the first time, Sophia had truly understood the pain Natalie had carried for so long. Maybe, just maybe, Sophia had realised how deeply her actions had affected her sister. Natalie smiled softly, her fingers brushing the edges of the photograph. She didn't know what the future held for her and Sophia. She didn't know if they would ever speak again, or if this small gesture was enough to mend the rift between them. But she didn't need an answer today. For the first time, she realised that it wasn't about fixing everything. It wasn't about winning back what had been lost. It was about letting go. She folded the letter and placed it gently on the table. Then she walked over to her bookshelf, where she had started collecting small tokens from the moments of her life that had shaped her into the person she was now. Without saying a word, she slid the letter into the front of the shelf, next to a few old books and trinkets. It was her way of keeping it, acknowledging the past without letting it control her. The air in the room felt lighter, and she stood there for a moment, just breathing. For the first time, Natalie didn't feel invisible. She wasn't the daughter who had been discarded. She wasn't the person who had always been overlooked. She was seen, if only in this quiet, unexpected way. And for that, she was grateful. No phone call, no reconciliation, but the gesture was enough. For the first time in a long while, she felt like a part of something again. Not because of her family's approval, but because in some small way someone had acknowledged her existence. Someone had seen her, not as a tool, not as an object, but as a person worthy of being remembered. She smiled again, and for the first time in her life, it wasn't out of hope for approval. It was just for herself.